On the final night of November 1942, Lieutenant Rollin Westholm reduced the throttle of his patrol torpedo boat to barely above idle speed. The waters off Guadalcanal's northwestern shore lay still in complete darkness. 3 powerful marine engines, each generating 1,500 horsepower, now produced only a quiet rumble as their exhaust systems remained just beneath the water's surface. 4 additional patrol boats drifted nearby in the moonless night, their crews searching the black horizon for movement. The Americans called them various names, the Rat Run being among the most common. For the Japanese Navy, these were designated as high-speed transport missions, though this formal terminology belied their critical importance to the garrison forces stationed on Guadalcanal. With predictable regularity every few nights, Japanese destroyers and swift cruisers raced through the channel separating the Solomon Islands, delivered supplies and reinforcements to the beaches, then retreated northward before daylight exposed them to American aerial attacks. The schedule had become familiar and grimly dependable. West had conducted these operations for 6 weeks, working from Tulagi Harbor, situated across the Sound from Henderson Field. His vessel, along with others in the 3rd Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron, carried 4 torpedoes measuring 21 inches in diameter. Each of these Mark 8 weapons weighed nearly 3,000 pounds and possessed the capability to destroy a destroyer with accurate placement. The cost of each torpedo exceeded $10,000, more than most enlisted personnel would earn across an entire decade. On this particular evening, West had received orders to deploy them. The intelligence briefing had been precise in its details. A substantial Japanese reinforcement convoy was anticipated, potentially consisting of 8 destroyers transporting troops and supplies for the beleaguered garrison. Hidden observers positioned in the jungle-covered hills of surrounding islands had transmitted sighting reports hours earlier. The enemy formation was advancing southward at considerable velocity, approximately 30 knots, which meant they would reach the narrow waters of Tassafaronga within the hour. These patrol torpedo boats represented something both ancient and modern in naval combat. They were small, rapid vessels with wooden hulls, operated by crews of fewer than 12 men, yet equipped with torpedoes theoretically capable of destroying ships weighing 1,000 times their own displacement. The Navy had commissioned them urgently after Pearl Harbor shattered any comfortable assumptions about American naval supremacy in the Pacific theater. Motor torpedo boat squadrons could be constructed economically, trained quickly, and were expendable in ways that capital ships could never be. Yet expendable did not mean ineffective, and the crews manning these vessels were learning through each mission how to transform their vulnerability into tactical advantage. They had discovered how to shut down their engines and drift silently in darkness, listening for the characteristic turbine sound of Japanese destroyers. They had learned to launch their torpedoes from distances of less than 1,000 yards, far closer than any destroyer commander would consider safe. They had realized that the Japanese, supremely confident in their nocturnal combat capabilities and superior optical equipment, rarely anticipated attacks from vessels as diminutive as patrol torpedo boats. This night would test whether those accumulated lessons would translate into measurable success. West checked his timepiece. The luminous hands indicated 11 o'clock in the evening. If the coastal observers' calculations were accurate, the Japanese destroyers would arrive shortly. The sea remained calm, the atmosphere warm and laden with moisture. Somewhere to the north, advancing rapidly through the tropical darkness, the Tokyo Express was approaching. To comprehend why patrol torpedo boats were pursuing destroyers in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal during late November 1942, one must first understand the desperation characterizing both sides' positions on this distant Pacific island. 4 months earlier, on the 7th of August, the 1st Marine Division had conducted amphibious landings on Guadalcanal in the initial major American offensive operation of the Pacific Campaign. Their objective was an airfield under Japanese construction near Lunga Point. The Marines captured the airfield, renamed it Henderson Field, and suddenly found themselves controlling a strategic position that neither force could afford to relinquish. For Japanese commanders, Guadalcanal represented the southern anchor of their defensive perimeter. Losing the island would expose Rabaul, their principal regional base, and potentially create opportunities for American advances northward through the Solomon Islands toward the Philippines. For American forces, Henderson Field provided the sole land-based air power within operational range of the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. Control of that airfield meant control of airspace over the Central Solomons, and control of airspace would ultimately determine the campaign's outcome. The central problem was logistics. The Marines on Guadalcanal required food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. The Japanese garrison, expanding as Tokyo committed additional troops to recapturing the island, required identical supplies. However, neither force could safely conduct resupply operations during daylight hours. American possession of Henderson Field meant that Japanese ships or transports attempting daytime approaches would face attack by Marine dive bombers and fighters. Conversely, Japanese air power from Rabaul, though diminished by distance and attrition, remained potent enough to threaten American supply convoys during daylight. This tactical deadlock produced the Tokyo Express phenomenon. Japanese destroyers, swift and heavily armed, would race through what was called the slot under darkness's protection. Reaching Guadalcanal after midnight, they would transfer supplies and troops directly to beaches or barges, then sprint back northward to escape beyond Henderson Field's aircraft range before dawn. The destroyers transported supplies in drums that could be pushed overboard and floated ashore, or in situations where speed was less essential, they would decelerate sufficiently to transfer cargo to landing craft. The system was inherently inefficient. Destroyers made inadequate cargo vessels. Each ship could transport perhaps 30 to 50 tons of supplies when configured for transport missions, substantially less than proper cargo vessels. The drums frequently broke apart in the surf, dispersing their contents of rice, ammunition, or medical supplies into the ocean. Troops had to wade ashore or transfer to smaller craft in darkness, a process resulting in regular drownings when men slipped while descending cargo nets, or when overloaded craft capsized in the swells. Yet inefficient supply exceeded no supply whatsoever, and the Tokyo Express operations continued with mounting frequency throughout September, October, and November of 1942. The Japanese destroyers possessed sufficient speed to outpace most American surface vessels, and their crews had received superior training in nocturnal combat, possessing optical equipment and tactical doctrine, providing consistent advantages in darkness. American attempts to intercept these operations with cruisers and destroyers had produced mixed outcomes at best and catastrophic losses at worst. The naval engagements at Cape Esperance, Savo Island, and during the first night of the naval battle of Guadalcanal had demonstrated that American surface forces were not yet prepared to engage the Imperial Japanese Navy at night on equal terms. This situation brought patrol torpedo boats into consideration, not as an ideal solution, but as an available one. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had arrived at Tulagi during October 1942 with 12 vessels. These were 80-foot boats constructed by the Electric Launch Company in Bayonne, New Jersey. Built from plywood over wooden frames and powered by 3 Packard engines capable of pushing them beyond 40 knots in calm conditions, each boat carried 4 torpedoes, typically Mark 8 models with 500-pound warheads mounted in tubes on the forward deck. The operational doctrine governing patrol torpedo boat deployment in late 1942 remained largely theoretical, derived from pre-war studies and limited combat experience in the Philippines earlier that year. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and senior officers who had advocated for the motor torpedo boat concept envisioned these vessels operating under specific tactical circumstances, attacking large enemy warships or transports in restricted waters, conducting raids on enemy harbors and anchorages, or serving as high-speed scouts for larger fleet units. The reality at Guadalcanal matched none of these idealized scenarios. The patrol torpedo boats were not engaging slow merchant vessels in harbors. They were attempting to intercept destroyers capable of 35 knots, operated by personnel extensively trained in night combat, equipped with superior optical rangefinders and searchlights, and armed with 5-inch guns, capable of obliterating a patrol torpedo boat with one direct hit. The tactical challenge was not theoretical, it was immediately and lethally practical. The Mark 8 torpedo itself presented complications that training had not fully addressed. The weapon operated on compressed air, leaving a visible wake of bubbles that experienced lookouts could detect even at night under favorable conditions. The torpedo's maximum range was 6,000 yards at 36 knots, but firing at maximum distance meant targets would have ample time to maneuver. The effective range, based on early war experience, was closer to 1,000 yards, which required patrol torpedo boats to approach point-blank range by destroyer standards before launching their weapons. The boats themselves were fragile in ways their wooden construction could not conceal. Plywood and mahogany kept them lightweight and swift, but a single 5-inch shell would pass through both sides of the hull without detonating, leaving massive openings that would flood the vessel within minutes. The 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the boats, typically 4 in various positions, could damage a destroyer's superstructure or eliminate exposed crew members, but they could not penetrate armor or disable gun turrets. In any sustained exchange of fire, the patrol torpedo boat would lose. This meant patrol torpedo boat tactics at Guadalcanal evolved through necessity rather than doctrine. Crews learned to operate with engines at idle, sometimes shutting down entirely to listen for enemy vessels. They learned to use the shoreline as backdrop, positioning themselves so enemy ships would be silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky near the horizon. They learned to fire torpedoes and immediately turn away at maximum speed, using smoke generators to obscure their retreat and prevent the enemy from accurately tracking their position. They also learned to accept failure as the norm rather than the exception. Throughout October and most of November, patrol torpedo boat attacks on the Tokyo Express had produced minimal results. Torpedoes missed their targets in darkness. Boats were caught by searchlights and forced to retreat under fire before they could launch. Communication problems meant boats would arrive at intercept positions too early or too late, missing the enemy convoy entirely. The squadron's operational records for those months documented consistent patrol activity, but few confirmed successful strikes. The crews understood their position in the naval hierarchy. They were not fleet units. They were not even proper warships in the estimation of many senior officers who viewed motor torpedo boats as experimental at best and wasteful at worst. Their primary value was presence, the knowledge that American forces were attempting to contest the Tokyo Express runs, even when conventional surface units could not safely operate in the confined waters after dark. But presence without results bred frustration, particularly among crews who spent their nights drifting in darkness, breathing gasoline fumes from their engines, watching Japanese destroyers race past, and returning to base with torpedoes still mounted in their tubes. The psychological toll of repeated missions without success, combined with knowledge that the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal continued growing stronger with each successful supply run, created a sense of futility that no amount of courage could fully overcome. November 30th would be different, though West and his crew had no way of knowing this as they drifted in the darkness off Tassafaronga. The difference would not come from new equipment or revised doctrine. It would come from circumstance, from the specific tactical situation that would develop in the next hour, and from the decisions that individual boat commanders would make when confronted with targets moving through their patrol area at high speed. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron. 3 had arrived at Tulagi aboard the seaplane tender Machine on October 12, 1942. The squadron consisted of 12 boats divided into 2 divisions of 6 boats each. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery commanded the squadron with Lieutenant West serving as executive officer and commanding the 2nd Division. The boats themselves were relatively new, most having been completed within the previous 6 months at the company's Bayonne facility. Each boat measured exactly 80 feet in length with a beam of 20 feet and 8 inches. The hull was constructed from 2 layers of mahogany planking, each 5/8 of an inch thick, laid over white oak frames spaced 9 inches apart. The double planking ran diagonally in opposite directions, creating a structure that was simultaneously lightweight and surprisingly strong in longitudinal stress. The entire hull was fastened, together with thousands of bronze screws and copper rivets, materials chosen because they would not corrode in salt water. 3. Packard engines powered each boat, marinized versions of 12-cylinder aircraft engines. Each engine displaced 2,500 cubic inches and produced 1,500 brake horsepower at 2,400 revolutions per minute. The engines consumed high-octane aviation gasoline, 100 octane, which was significantly more volatile than the fuel oil used by larger warships. Each boat carried 3,000 gallons of this gasoline in self-sealing tanks, sufficient for roughly 500 nautical miles at cruising speed, or approximately 12 hours of continuous operation. The main armament consisted of 4 torpedo tubes mounted on the forward deck. The standard loadout was Mark 8 torpedoes, each measuring 20 feet and 7 inches in length, weighing 2,615 pounds including the 500-pound warhead. The Mark 8 operated on compressed air stored in a flask at 2,600 pounds per square inch. After launch, the torpedo would accelerate to its preset speed, either 27 knots for maximum range of 16,000 yards or 36 knots for a range of 6,000 yards. In practice, patrol torpedo boats at Guadalcanal typically set their torpedoes for the higher speed setting, accepting reduced range in exchange for less time for the target to maneuver. Secondary armament varied somewhat between boats, but the standard configuration included 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. 2 were typically mounted on the forward deck ahead of the torpedo tubes, 1 on each side. 2 more were mounted aft, 1 on each side of the cockpit or day cabin. Each gun could fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, depending on the specific model and condition. The 50 caliber round could penetrate light armor at ranges under 500 yards and was effective against aircraft, small craft, and exposed personnel on larger ships. The crew complement was typically 2 officers and 9 enlisted men. The commanding officer, usually a lieutenant, stood in the cockpit alongside the helmsman during combat operations. The executive officer, often an ensign, typically manned one of the machine gun positions or supervised the torpedo crew. The engineering crew consisted of 3 men, 1 for each engine, responsible for monitoring temperature, oil pressure, and fuel flow during high-speed operations. The remaining crew members served as lookouts, torpedo men, gunners, and radio operators as needed. Training for patrol torpedo boat duty had been compressed by the urgency of war. Most officers had attended a brief course at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island, where they learned basic seamanship, torpedo tactics, and engine maintenance. The course lasted only 8 weeks, far shorter than the training required for officers serving aboard destroyers or cruisers. Enlisted men received even less formal instruction, often learning their duties through on-the-job training after reporting to their squadrons. This abbreviated training reflected the Navy's desperate need for patrol torpedo boats in the Pacific, but it also meant crews arrived at combat zones with minimal practical experience. Lieutenant West had been operating these boats for less than 6 months before arriving at Guadalcanal. Many of his crew members had never been to sea before joining the Navy. They learned through repetition and observation, through the accumulated small failures that did not result in death, and through the advice of the few men who had survived combat in the Philippines earlier that year. The maintenance requirements for these boats were substantial and constant. The Packard engines required careful attention, particularly in the tropical environment of the South Pacific, where heat, humidity, and salt spray accelerated corrosion and degraded lubricants. Each engine had to be thoroughly inspected after every patrol, with oil changed, spark plugs examined, and cooling systems flushed. The wooden hulls absorbed water and required regular drying and treatment to prevent rot. The plywood decks, despite being sealed with multiple coats of marine varnish, would begin to delaminate after a few months of exposure to tropical sun and salt water. The base at Tulagi provided minimal support facilities. There was no proper dry dock, no machine shop capable of major engine overhauls, and no stockpile of replacement parts. When engines failed, which they did with disturbing regularity, repair crews had to improvise solutions using whatever materials were available. When hulls were damaged by running aground or by enemy fire, repairs were accomplished with plywood patches and whatever adhesives could be obtained. The sound reached the patrol boat first as a distant rhythmic thrumming, barely audible over the idle of the vessel's own engines. West raised his hand, signaling for complete silence. The engine men immediately shut down all 3 Packards. In the sudden quiet, the sound became clearer, the high-pitched turbine whine of destroyer propulsion systems running at high speed. The Tokyo Express had arrived. West could see nothing yet. The night was moonless, with heavy cloud cover obscuring even the stars, but the sound was unmistakable and growing steadily louder. He picked up the radio handset and transmitted a brief contact report to the other boats in his division, giving his best estimate of the enemy's bearing and range based purely on sound. The other boats acknowledged in whispers over the radio circuit. The first visual contact came perhaps 2 minutes later when one of the lookouts spotted a darker mass moving against the black horizon to the northwest. Then another, then several more. The Japanese formation was larger than expected, at least 8 destroyers running in column formation at high speed. They were perhaps 4,000 yards distant, moving at what appeared to be close to 30 knots, heading almost directly toward the patrol boat's position. West made his decision quickly. The geometry was nearly perfect. The destroyers would pass within 1,000 yards of his position, if they maintained their current course and speed. At this range, and with the enemy's high speed, he would get exactly one shot. He ordered the engine men to restart the engines but keep them at idle. He would need power immediately after firing to turn away and escape, before the destroyers could bring their guns to bear. The Mark 8 torpedoes had already been set for high speed, 36 knots with a depth setting of 10 feet. The depth was critical. Set too shallow, and the torpedoes might porpoise or broach the surface. Set too deep, and they would run harmlessly beneath the destroyers' hulls. 10 feet represented the best compromise based on intelligence about Japanese destroyer draft and the estimated sea state. The range continued to close. 3,000 yards, 2,500, 2,000. West waited, fighting the urge to fire too early. The textbook firing solution called for launching at 1,000 yards, but that assumed good visibility and accurate range estimation. In this darkness, with only the vague silhouettes of the destroyers visible against the horizon, range estimation was more guesswork than science. At approximately 1,200 yards, West gave the order to fire. The torpedo tubes released compressed air with a sharp hiss, and the first Mark 8 dropped into the water with a heavy splash. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo launched. Then the third. The fourth and final torpedo hung up briefly in its tube before the torpedo men managed to clear the obstruction and launch it manually. By the time the fourth torpedo entered the water, the first had already traveled several hundred yards toward the enemy column. West immediately ordered full power. The 3 Packards roared to life, and the vessel surged forward, turning hard to starboard to put distance between the boat and the enemy destroyers. The other boats in the division were also firing now, their torpedo launches visible as brief flashes of white water in the darkness. Within perhaps 90 seconds, 15 or 16 torpedoes were running toward the Japanese formation. The Japanese response was almost immediate. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping the water in search of attackers. Star shells burst overhead, bathing the scene in harsh magnesium light that turned the darkness into a strange twilight. 5-inch guns began firing, their muzzle flashes bright orange in the artificial illumination. The shells passed overhead with sounds like tearing canvas, raising enormous geysers where they struck the water. West kept the throttles at maximum, steering evasively, changing course every few seconds to make his boat a more difficult target. Behind him, he could hear the 50 caliber gunners firing at the searchlights, though with little apparent effect at this range. The boat was making perhaps 38 knots now, slamming hard against the chop, every impact jarring the crew and threatening to shake loose equipment. Then came the explosions. The first was a deep resonant boom that rolled across the water, followed seconds later by another, then a third. West risked a glance over his shoulder and saw a column of fire rising from one of the destroyers. A fourth explosion illuminated another ship in the column. The torpedoes were hitting. What happened in the next several minutes would only become clear hours later, when all the boats had returned to Tulagi and the crews could compare their observations. The Japanese destroyer column had sailed directly into the patrol torpedo boats' spread of torpedoes at high speed, giving their lookouts minimal time to spot the torpedo wakes and virtually no time to maneuver. At least 4 torpedoes had struck home, possibly more. The destroyer that took the first hit had been blown nearly in half, her back broken by the massive explosion of 500 pounds of high explosive detonating against her hull. She was already sinking, her bow and stern rising at steep angles as the sea rushed into her ruptured hull. The Japanese formation disintegrated into chaos. Destroyers that moments before had been running in tight column formation now scattered in all directions, their commanders uncertain where the attack had originated and how many attackers they faced. Some turned toward the perceived threat, attempting to close with the patrol torpedo boats and engage them with guns. Others turned away, seeking to escape the torpedo water. 2 destroyers collided while maneuvering at high speed in darkness, their hulls grinding together with a screech of tortured metal that carried clearly across the water. The patrol boats continued racing away at maximum speed, steering erratically, trailing smoke from their generators to confuse the Japanese gunners. The star shells continued to burst overhead, and 5-inch shells continued to fall around them. But the extreme range and the darkness made accurate fire nearly impossible. After perhaps 10 minutes of this running fight, the patrol torpedo boats had opened enough distance that the Japanese ceased fire and turned their attention to rescuing survivors from the sinking destroyers. West brought his boat around in a wide arc, maintaining a safe distance but keeping the enemy formation in sight. He could see at least 2 destroyers dead in the water, both clearly damaged. One was down by the bow, her stern riding high, likely taking on water forward. The other appeared to be listing heavily to port. The remaining destroyers were circling, lowering boats and throwing lines to men in the water. The Tokyo Express had been stopped, at least for tonight. The return to Tulagi took nearly 2 hours. The boats proceeded at moderate speed to conserve fuel and to minimize the chance of mechanical breakdown. Each boat reported its status over the radio circuit. West's vessel had expended all 4 torpedoes and approximately 300 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The boat had sustained no damage and no casualties. Other boats in the division reported similar status, though one had taken a single 5-inch shell through her aft section that had fortunately failed to detonate, passing completely through the boat's plywood hull and exiting out the opposite side without striking anything vital. As the boats entered Tulagi harbour and tied up at the floating dock, the crews were met by the squadron commander and intelligence officers who immediately began debriefing them on the night's action. The initial reports were confused and contradictory, as after-action reports always are when they are compiled from observations made in darkness under combat conditions. Some crews claimed to have seen as many as 6 destroyers hit. Others reported only 2 or 3. The exact number of torpedoes fired varied, depending on which crew member was asked. What was not in dispute was that the patrol torpedo boats had achieved their first significant success against the Tokyo Express. Multiple Japanese destroyers had been damaged or sunk. The supply run had been disrupted. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal would not receive the reinforcements and supplies they desperately needed, at least not tonight. The cost had been minimal. Some expended ordnance, some fuel, and one boat with a hole through her hull that could be repaired by morning. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in the details of the torpedo attacks, the range at which the boats had fired, the estimated speed and course of the targets, the observed explosion effects. This information would be compiled into reports and sent up the chain of command, eventually reaching the Bureau of Ordnance and the officers responsible for developing patrol torpedo boat tactics. Each successful engagement provided data that could be used to refine doctrine and improve the odds of success in future operations. But for the crews, the debriefing was merely an administrative formality before they could address more immediate concerns. The boats needed refueling and rearming. The engines needed inspection and maintenance. The crews needed food and rest before the next patrol, which would likely occur the following night if intelligence indicated another Tokyo Express run was expected. The rhythm of operations at Guadalcanal allowed little time for celebration or reflection. Success in one engagement merely meant survival to face the next. The broader significance of the night's action would only become apparent over the following days and weeks, as additional information filtered in from multiple sources. Coastal Observer reports confirmed that heavily damaged Japanese destroyers had been observed limping northward at reduced speed. The following morning, radio intercepts revealed increased Japanese communications traffic discussing casualties and damage. Reconnaissance flights from Henderson Field photographed damaged destroyers under repair at Rabaul and noted that fewer destroyers were available for subsequent Tokyo Express runs. The psychological impact on both sides was significant. For the Japanese, the realization that even their fast destroyer runs were no longer safe from attack would force reconsideration of their supply strategy. The destroyers that had seemed invulnerable to anything except major surface units were now vulnerable to attacks from small boats that could hide in the darkness and strike without warning. For the Americans, the success provided proof that the patrol torpedo boats, despite their fragility and their limited firepower, could meaningfully contribute to the campaign when employed under the right circumstances. Commander Montgomery filed his action report 48 hours after the engagement. His report was measured and professional, noting both the successes and the limitations of the attack. He emphasized that the favorable tactical geometry, the moonless night providing maximum concealment, and the Japanese formation's high speed reducing their ability to maneuver had all contributed to the outcome. He cautioned against assuming that similar results could be achieved under less favorable conditions, but he also recommended that patrol torpedo boat patrols be increased in frequency and that additional boats be assigned to the Guadalcanal area as soon as possible. The engagement off. Tassafaronga on the night of November 30th, 1942, marked a turning point not in the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign, which remained desperately contested for weeks to come, but in the tactical calculus governing Japanese supply operations. The Imperial Japanese Navy had relied on the speed and night-fighting superiority of their destroyers to maintain the Tokyo Express runs with acceptable losses. The realization that small, inexpensive motor torpedo boats could inflict significant damage on these fast warships forced a fundamental reassessment of risk. Japanese naval records, captured after the war, revealed the internal discussions that followed the November engagement. One destroyer had sunk outright, taking down 197 of her crew. Another had suffered severe damage to her bow and required 3 weeks of repairs before she could return to service. A third had sustained moderate damage from a near miss that buckled hull plates and flooded 2 compartments. The total casualties exceeded 300 men killed or wounded, an unsustainable loss rate for what was supposed to be a routine supply mission. The Japanese response came in multiple forms. Destroyer captains received instructions to approach Guadalcanal at reduced speeds when intelligence suggested patrol torpedo boats might be operating in the area. Sacrificing the speed advantage that had previously made the Tokyo Express runs relatively safe, they were ordered to deploy additional lookouts specifically tasked with watching for torpedo wakes and small craft. Some destroyers began carrying additional depth charges and small-caliber guns specifically for use against patrol torpedo boats, though these additions reduced the cargo capacity available for supplies and troops. More significantly, the Japanese Navy began experimenting with alternative supply methods that might prove less vulnerable to patrol torpedo boat attack. Fast cruisers replaced destroyers on some runs, their heavier armor and more numerous guns providing better protection against torpedo attack, though at the cost of reduced cargo capacity. Submarines were pressed into supply service, carrying critical items like medicine and ammunition in their torpedo rooms, and delivering these supplies submerged during daylight hours when patrol torpedo boats were less effective. Barges and small cargo vessels began making supply runs in larger numbers, accepting that many would be lost to air attack, but calculating that enough might survive to maintain the garrison. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem. Guadalcanal remained a logistics nightmare for the Japanese, a remote position at the end of an extended supply line that was under constant attack from multiple directions. The patrol torpedo boats represented only one element of this pressure, but they were an element that the Japanese could not ignore and could not effectively counter without diverting resources from other critical needs. The American response to the November success was to expand patrol torpedo boat operations as rapidly as available resources allowed. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 arrived at Tulagi in early December with an additional 12 boats. Squadron 6 followed in January of 1943. By February, more than 30 patrol torpedo boats were operating in the Solomons, conducting nightly patrols and establishing a presence that forced the Japanese to account for them in every operational plan. The boats themselves continued to suffer from mechanical problems and the harsh operating environment. Engine failures remained common, particularly among boats that had been in service for several months. Hull damage from running aground on uncharted reefs or coral heads required constant repair. The tropical heat caused fuel to evaporate from tanks faster than expected, reducing operational range. Crews suffered from tropical diseases, particularly malaria, which became endemic among personnel stationed at Tulagi despite the distribution of anti-malarial tablets. But the boats kept operating, and their cumulative effect on Japanese operations proved significant. Intelligence estimates compiled in January of 1943 indicated that the Tokyo Express runs were delivering approximately 40% less cargo per mission than they had in October, primarily because destroyers were spending more time evading suspected patrol, torpedo boat positions, and less time actually unloading supplies. The psychological effect on Japanese crews was also noted in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Destroyer sailors who had once considered the fast runs to Guadalcanal as relatively routine missions now approached them with considerable apprehension, knowing that small boats might be waiting in the darkness with torpedoes. The cost in American resources was minimal compared to the results achieved. Each patrol torpedo boat cost approximately $200,000 to build, roughly 1% the cost of a destroyer. The torpedoes they carried were expensive, but still far cheaper than the naval gunfire and aerial bombardment that would otherwise be required to achieve similar damage to enemy warships. The crews required minimal training compared to the years of preparation needed to man a battleship or carrier. From a purely economic perspective, patrol torpedo boats represented an efficient allocation of limited resources in a theatre where every ship, every aircraft, and every trained man was desperately needed. The success of November 30th established a pattern that would repeat with variations throughout December of 1942 and into January of 1943. The Tokyo Express continued to operate because the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal required supplies and reinforcements, regardless of the risks involved. The patrol torpedo boats continued to intercept these runs, achieving varying degrees of success depending on tactical circumstances, weather conditions, and the specific countermeasures the Japanese employed. On the night of December 3rd, patrol torpedo boats engaged another Japanese destroyer force. This time the results were less favorable. The destroyers had deployed additional lookouts and were proceeding at reduced speed with guns manned and ready. When the patrol torpedo boats approached a firing range, the destroyers illuminated them with searchlights and engaged immediately with 5-inch guns. 2 patrol torpedo boats were damaged, one severely enough that it had to be towed back to base. The torpedo attacks were hurried and poorly aimed. No hits were observed, though the Japanese reported one near miss that caused minor shock damage. The engagement demonstrated that tactical success was never guaranteed. The Japanese were learning and adapting just as the Americans were. Each encounter provided lessons for both sides, a continuous cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that characterized naval warfare throughout the campaign. The patrol torpedo boats' advantages of small size, high speed, and low visibility in darkness could be partially negated by alert lookouts, aggressive gunnery, and effective use of searchlights and starshells. But the statistical trend favored the Americans. Even when patrol torpedo boat attacks failed to sink or damage enemy ships, they disrupted operations and forced the Japanese to expend time and resources on defensive measures. Destroyer captains had to choose between maintaining high speed and maintaining alertness for torpedo attack. They could not do both effectively. Time spent evading suspected patrol torpedo boat positions was time not spent unloading supplies. Ammunition expended firing at patrol torpedo boats was ammunition not available for bombarding Henderson Field or engaging American surface units. On December 11th, patrol torpedo boats achieved another significant success, damaging 2 destroyers with torpedo hits during a coordinated attack involving 8 boats operating in 3 divisions. The attack demonstrated improved coordination and communication between boats, with multiple units converging on the enemy formation from different directions simultaneously. The Japanese found themselves illuminating targets in multiple directions, unable to concentrate their defensive fire effectively. 3 torpedoes struck home in rapid succession, leaving 1 destroyer dead in the water and another reduced to half speed with heavy flooding. The pattern continued through the remainder of December. Some engagements produced clear successes with confirmed damage to enemy vessels. Others resulted in near misses, torpedo malfunctions, or premature withdrawal under heavy fire. A few engagements saw patrol torpedo boats unable to locate the enemy at all, wandering through the darkness while the Tokyo Express completed its mission and departed unmolested. But the cumulative effect was undeniable. The Japanese supply situation on Guadalcanal continued to deteriorate, not because the patrol torpedo boats had completely stopped the Tokyo Express, but because they had made it significantly more difficult, more dangerous, and less efficient. By late December, Japanese commanders were facing increasingly difficult decisions about resource allocation. Should they continue risking valuable destroyers and trained crews on supply missions to Guadalcanal? Should they accept higher losses in exchange for maintaining the garrison's combat effectiveness? Or should they begin planning for withdrawal, acknowledging that the island could not be held against the combined pressure of American air power, naval forces, and the patrol torpedo boats that controlled the night waters? The decision was postponed through December and into January, as Tokyo sent additional reinforcements and ordered the garrison to hold at all costs. But the mathematical reality was becoming inescapable. The Tokyo Express could not deliver enough supplies to maintain a force of 30,000 men in combat readiness, while simultaneously replacing losses from American attacks. The Japanese troops on Guadalcanal were slowly starving. Their ammunition stockpiles were dwindling, and their medical supplies were exhausted. Disease claimed more casualties than combat, with malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition reducing entire units to ineffectiveness. The patrol torpedo boats had not created this situation alone. American control of Henderson Field and the Marine and Army aircraft operating from that field remained the primary factor strangling the Japanese garrison. The periodic naval bombardments by American cruisers and battleships though costly in terms of ships lost, prevented the Japanese from using the waters around Guadalcanal safely even at night. The Marines and Army troops pushing slowly across the island from multiple directions maintained constant pressure that prevented the Japanese from consolidating their positions. But the patrol torpedo boats had eliminated one of the few advantages the Japanese still possessed: the ability to resupply their forces at night using fast destroyers that could evade or defeat most American naval units. That advantage was gone. The small wooden boats with their inexperienced crews and limited firepower had proven capable of threatening even the Imperial Navy's finest destroyers when conditions favored the attack. The psychological effect of this realization extended far beyond Guadalcanal, influencing Japanese operational planning throughout the South Pacific. By early February of 1943, the Japanese High Command made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. The official terminology described it as a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions, but the reality was simpler. The island could not be held. The Tokyo Express conducted its final missions not as supply runs, but as evacuation operations, with destroyers racing to the island under cover of darkness to retrieve as many survivors as possible before American forces could interfere. Over 3 nights in early February, Japanese destroyers successfully evacuated approximately 11,000 men from Guadalcanal, leaving behind their dead, their equipment, and any pretense that the campaign had been anything other than a devastating defeat. The patrol torpedo boats were present during these final evacuation runs, conducting their usual patrols and attacking when opportunities presented themselves. But the Japanese destroyers, no longer burdened with cargo and focused solely on speed and survival, were more difficult targets. Most escaped without serious damage, though several patrol torpedo boat attacks forced them to abandon planned pickup points, resulting in hundreds of Japanese troops being left behind to face capture. Lieutenant West continued commanding his vessel through January before being reassigned to staff duty in early February. He was replaced by a newly arrived officer who would achieve his own measure of recognition, commanding that same boat in August of 1943, when it was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer in Blackett Strait. The new commander and his crew survived and were eventually rescued, but the incident illustrated the persistent danger of patrol torpedo boat operations and the fine line between success and catastrophe that crews navigated on every mission. The strategic significance of patrol torpedo boat operations at Guadalcanal extended beyond the immediate tactical results. The boats had proven that small, inexpensive vessels operated by minimally trained crews could meaningfully affect naval operations when employed intelligently under favorable circumstances. This lesson influenced American naval planning. Throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, patrol torpedo boat squadrons were expanded and deployed to theaters where their speed and torpedo armament could be effectively utilized. Production increased with over 500 such boats built by the end of the war. The boats never became decisive weapons in the way that aircraft carriers or submarines were decisive. They remained auxiliary vessels, useful in specific circumstances, but unable to fundamentally alter the strategic balance. Their greatest contribution was cumulative rather than spectacular. The steady pressure of nightly patrols and the constant threat of torpedo attack that forced enemy commanders to divert resources and attention that might otherwise have been concentrated elsewhere. The men who crewed these boats paid their own price for this contribution. Of the roughly 30 patrol torpedo boats that operated around Guadalcanal between October of 1942 and February of 1943, 6 were lost to enemy action or operational accidents. 43 crew members were killed and dozens more were wounded. Many more suffered from tropical diseases, exhaustion, and the accumulated psychological stress of repeated combat missions in fragile boats where a single enemy shell could prove fatal. For those who survived, the memory